panel discussion titled Panel Discussion, Tribal Knowledge, KCS Tribal Knowledge at Your Fingertips. This is a deeper dive panel discussion. We had one earlier in the year, and this is kind of a continuation of that panel, or that original presentation. The overview of the form of the presentation is going to follow. I'm going to ask the panelists 6 questions. After each panelist has had an opportunity to answer, we'll move on to the next one. There will be time left over for Q&A at the end. Everyone will be placed on mute, and please use the chat window to ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat queue and bringing up the questions as they come in. And again, we'll have time at the end to go over questions as well. We are extremely honored to have with us today a mixed panel of 3 distinguished service management professionals. First, we have Jeff Toddy. He's an IT service management coordinator at Miami University. Next, we have Chelsea Noble. She's a knowledge management associate at the University of Notre Dame, Office of Information Technology. And finally, we have Robert Doty. He's the technical writer at the University of Southern California, my colleague in arms. Presentation will last about 30 to 45 minutes. And so without further ado, let me get to the next slide here. Oh, this is the bio. The bios is on the slide deck for your perusal later. Here we are with the questions. Let's go ahead and jump into the first question. Actually, let's do this first. Before we dive into the questions, Jeff, why don't you give us a basic overview, refresher on what KCS is, and then we'll jump into the actual questions.
Sure. I imagine if you're signed up for this second webinar in the series, many of you are familiar with the concept. But for those of you that are not, KCS is really a new way to look at reactive knowledge management. So, your proactive knowledge management, if you're going to change a system or you're going to introduce a new service and you realize that that's going to have some impacts on your clients, that and you want to do some documentation to...
Jeff, let me stop for a sec. I want to make sure we're recording the session.
Sure.
So, Chelsea, can you go ahead and hit the record button for me?
Yes, we're already recording.
Yep, I see a recording thing in the upper left-hand corner, so I think
awesome. I don't see that. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Jeff.
Sure, no problem. The proactive knowledge management is still a thing, and it's separate from this discussion. This is really about those new issues that come into your environment. And so, with traditional knowledge management, sometimes it takes a long time to get through the workflow of publishing knowledge, and a lot of times the knowledge isn't what clients are actually looking for and not what they're actually asking. And so KCS provides us a way to link every request for help to a new or existing knowledge article. And in that way, we have a knowledge base that is eventually contains most of the questions that clients are asking, and they're in the context of the client, using words that the clients use to describe things instead of IT terms. And we get them into our live knowledge base very quickly, so we can catch that upswing of when knowledge is needed, and beat a lot of the questions into the service desk by publishing that knowledge out to our live knowledge base.
Okay, thank you for that overview. Question number 1, when should we advertise our knowledge base to our user community?
Sure, I can get started on that one. I think that this is a very important question because you really have one shot to advertise your knowledge base to the user community, because if it's going to take some effort for them to go out and find your knowledge base and learn how to use it and do a search or two. And if the first several things that a client goes out and searches for aren't available yet in your knowledge base, you're going to lose that customer. It's going to take them, it's going to be a big deal to get them to come back later. And so the recommendation is to wait until the vast majority of the issues that people are calling in about are already solved in your knowledge base. And so maybe when you have 80% of the tickets that are coming in, you're tying to existing knowledge articles, that might be a good time to start to advertise and really drive traffic to your knowledge base. And that could come months to a year or so after you endeavor on a KCS practice, if you have an environment that gets lots of, diverse types of requests.
I would also add that when you're trying to evaluate whether or not your knowledge base is ready, your service desk teams is a really good resource as well, because they're the ones that are in there most often before you're advertising to customers. So they know how easily searchable common questions are. And ideally, they're also contributing to making them more searchable if they're following KCS practices. But their voice in the decision of when a knowledge base is ready is, I think, a crucial part of the equation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo what was just said here. Having that minimum density of articles so that when a customer is going to that knowledge base, you at least have some sort of hit and you can get them to come back, because that's when you can actually deflect most of the calls that come in. Another thing also, I just wanted to add on to that, is just trying to make sure that your knowledge base works together with your KCS competencies. That way you don't accidentally get some bad knowledge out there to the customer.
All right, thank you. I think metrics are very important. So what metrics should we be using to measure our progress, make sure we're doing the things that we're supposed to do and being effective as we can make it be?
I'll start with this one. This is actually one of my favorite topics when we're talking about implementing KCS is how do you measure success? And it's a fine balancing act, because you do need to make sure that you're not just measuring activity within the knowledge base by your support staff. You want to actually measure quality interactions. So some of the ways we measure things is instead of just measuring how often articles are accessed, we're actually measuring how often an article is tied to a service ticket and shared with a customer. That counts way more than just a view count, because that means that not only did our staff interact with that knowledge, but it was provided to the customer directly, and seen as valuable that way. That's one of the major metrics that we follow to see whether or not individual articles are of value, but also whether or not our customers and our service staff are finding the information they need. When we're tying article usage to specific tickets, that way we get a more accurate ratio of activity versus, oh, I went through like 5 different articles for one ticket. That still only counts as one point towards that ratio. And that way we're not overbalancing or we're not overcompensating for a lack of activity in other tickets by loading up on one particular one.
Yeah, I think matching what you're doing with KCS to actual business results, or just correlating it to the success of the business, is the key thing for us. A few of the metrics that we're tracking are like first call resolution rate, average handle time, customer satisfaction scores. And then what we try to do is we try to correlate those to the amount of activity that the internal group is doing in terms of KCS. So that way you can see, even down to the individual level, you can see, hey, hey, consultant or analyst, whenever you are doing KCS to the full max, we notice that your average handle time goes way down, and then that's going to improve customer satisfaction in the future. So those are some of the things I would recommend, is do some sort of correlation with the actual success of the business, and not just do KCS for the sake of it.
Those are great suggestions. I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently and talk about the metrics of the participants in KCS. So as you're bringing new workers into your KCS process, there is the Consortium of Service Innovation, the IP holder of KCS, has a report card that's available that you can essentially look at. And the way that we've applied this at Miami is when a person is new to the KCS framework, we have them take every ticket that they work with and put that through this scorecard with an experienced coach. And we provide them feedback. They get immediate feedback on how they're doing as they're ramping up in KCS. And then as they become more of a mature KCS participant, we take a random sampling of the tickets that they work with and score those. And those are on things like, do they comply with our style guide? Did they create a new article when an existing one was already there that they should have been successfully searching for? And those types of things that make an individual successful in the framework. And we publish those on a public dashboard and do so in real time, because to have people compete against other people in their work group and see how they're adding to the overall expansion of our knowledge presence is something that has really driven adoption and enthusiasm around KCS in our environment. That like friendly, healthy competition between teammates has been a good thing for us.
Can I throw in one other thing too that I just thought of before we move on to the next question? Another metric that we found really valuable is in measuring KCS's effect on escalations to second and third level support. We kind of use this metric as a way to motivate our higher levels of support to contribute to the knowledge base. Anyone who has managed a knowledge base before knows that it's really hard to get your engineers and your top level analysts to contribute content that gets pushed down to the help desk. So what we do is we measure the overall ratio of incidents that are opened by the help desk that are solved at the help desk without having to move to another group. On top of that, we also measure the number of incidents that are resolved using articles that were written by second and third level support staff. And we send those reports back to those teams as well to say, hey, great job. Because you wrote these 5 articles, you've managed to deflect 20 incidents landing in your queue. And we even equate that to a roughly average time spent per ticket by second level support, and saying, by writing this article, you have saved yourself 20 FTE hours or what have you. And that has made a major impact on adoption by our higher levels of support. So that's another thing to keep in mind is how do you engage people outside of the service desk?
So I love that, because that kind of leads to our next question, right? Because so KCS is not just for your tier 0 or tier 1 staff, but for the entire organization. So from that perspective, how should the rollout process, how should it look internally? Where would you start, and how would you expand that out?
Sure, I'll jump on this one. And I will, because I think we've made a couple of mistakes in this area. I think that when we started rolling out KCS, we expanded a little bit faster than we had the coaches to support. And so to do so very slowly and very thoughtfully, making sure that you have the support from the more experienced KCS people, so the people that have gone through the certification training and really embody the methodology and really embrace the concept. Those folks will become your first coaches. And as you bring in new groups, service desk seems to be an obvious first choice, and the second level support organization, 1 or 2 of those perhaps afterwards, but making sure that you have the time as a coaching staff to help those people learn good habits right off the bat, make sure that they're not duplicating information in the knowledge base or otherwise using their newfound KCS powers in unfortunate ways, I think is very important. And along those lines, making sure that you get groups involved who are passionate about KCS and are already drinking the Kool-Aid, not trying to force participants that don't want to be there yet. The time for that is after 80% of the organizations on it, and you're already showing value in the metrics, bear out the results. it's easier to bring in the laggards then, and instead start with the people that want to do it at first, the early adopters and the enthusiastic people, because then it's almost like, oh, can my group do KCS yet? No, you got to wait your turn, and that kind of enthusiasm is not common, and it's good to leverage.
Hey, Jeff, this question came in for you. So do you have examples of how they could use KCS in bad ways, things to kind of watch out for?
Yeah, I'm mostly saying just people that I think one of the big ones is creating new knowledge cases when existing knowledge cases are there, or creating slight variations of things when an existing article should have been modified. That's usually where we see sort of like the lazy KCS behavior. And the result of that is a knowledge base that becomes unmaintainable. The whole point is that once an article is created, it's then applied to future instances of the same issue. And if you have multiple articles, they don't get applied as frequently, and so they don't get updated and ensured to be correct as often as if you have one article that gets used a whole bunch. And so that's a way to make a messy knowledge base quickly, is to have untrained, undercoached people in it.
Another thing with rolling out that I would support just about everything that Jeff said. When we first rolled out, one of the things that we did is we started with our help desk, because obviously they were going to be our heaviest users from the get-go. And it would have the most direct impact on their daily lives. But then we also invited kind of early adopters from second and third level support to kind of show that effectiveness early on. But we specifically targeted groups that we had a good working relationship with, who were interested in knowledge management, and who were what's the word I'm looking for? Who were also receiving a fair number of incidents from the help desk. So we targeted groups like our learning management systems team, who manages our Sakai platform, product management, which handles all of our Google Suite. So they're a pretty heavy traffic group, and one of our larger local support offices as well. And they were part of that kind of initial rollout, which helped us kind of set a template for other second and third level support groups as we brought them in.
Yeah, I would echo everything Chelsea and Jeff just mentioned. One thing I did want to add on to that is, as us in higher ed might experience, we do have a lot of student employees, and so what we did first is we started implementation with just the help desk at the call center, and our student workers work really closely with the full-time staff there. And once you have the full-time staff on board there, you can have a good motivating factor for the students, because they're also in the trenches with them at the same time. So whereas before, if you have student training where you're just telling students, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and don't give them a reason, I would suggest having, if you have full-time staff that also work with them, is to get them on board first, have them have a good understanding of it. That way they can proselytize.
We do have some questions in the queue. Some of these I'll wait till the end. Some, if they're related directly to the question, we'll go ahead and pop in with those questions. Let's move on to the next one. So in which areas has KCS most benefited your organization?
I'll start us off there. One of the first things we saw was in the first 6 months, we really reduced our average handle time just across the team. Like I mentioned, we did start off with our full-time staff, so that's the only part we were tracking at first. But we did reduce our average call time in that first 6 months by a little over a minute. And so if you add all that up, that's about like 40 work days that we saved in terms of just average handle time. So that was one of the major things we saw at first. As we've been going along, we've had new staff come on board, and turnaround with our student workers is pretty high. So we've seen a significant reduction in our onboarding. So that's been a great plus too. We've probably reduced that from anywhere between, we started off at like 4 weeks or so to get somebody up and running, at least from the basic support that we have. And we've reduced that to about 2 weeks or so, just by implementing KCS and saying, hey, we're going to teach you how to fish, and then you can take it from there. Another thing is just improved consistency when we bring on new services now. So I know we're kind of focusing on the more reactive knowledge, but the proactive part, the evolve loop, all that good stuff of creating articles before you do a launch has really helped out there. And then the last thing really is just the reactive part. New services come on board, or a new issue arises. We had one situation where we had something break early in the morning. We only had 1 or 2 consultants in at 8 a.m. For us. And right then and there, that person did the initial troubleshooting, wrote the knowledge article. And by the end of that day, we had over 100 knowledge views and probably around 50 incidents attached to that article. Just so it helped the whole team for that entire day. And it was from the ground floor.
Hey, Robert, real quick. Someone's asking, Walter's asking, what's the blend of student to staff ratio on the help desk or the CSC?
So it's probably 2 to 1.
Okay.
Obviously, students are going to be staggered in their scheduling. So I mean, but as far as full staff count, it's probably 2 to 1.
Great. Jeff or Chelsea, you want to add anything to add about how it's benefited your organization?
I'll go. One of the major improvements that we saw is just in overall communication within our organization. This is the first centralized knowledge base that not only the OIT, but all major IT organizations on campus are part of. As I'm sure a lot of you in higher ed have this experience where your central IT organization isn't always your only IT organization within the entire university. We have some schools that have their own IT departments. And this was the first time where we were all contributing to the same knowledge base. And that's really encouraged a level of openness and communication among teams that we hadn't seen previously. And that's been really, really encouraging to see. And there's more of a proactive approach to, if I write this down in the knowledge base, then the help desk can handle this. And so it's empowered the help desk to be more trusted by everyone else within the organization. It also directly benefited us in that we saved, talking once again about escalations out of the help desk to other teams, we saved, I think, an average of about 1 full-time employee's week's worth of work over the course of about 6 months in our initial rollout, in just time saved on incidents that weren't escalated out of the help desk. So it can really have a major impact on time and money saved as well.
Looking outside the organization, I think 2 of the major effects KCS has had is that it's really ratcheted up our trusted partner status amongst our clients, because the answers that we give as an organization are now more internally consistent. So it's not, who found what result on Google or who asked whom inside the organization. And a different answer comes out. They're a lot more similar that people are hearing, and that makes us look more professional, as does having answers in the client context, because we're using the words that clients use to describe our services instead of our internal IT speak, and that engenders us to the clients. And the last one, I will let you decide whether it's really a benefit or not, but there was a statewide initiative to outsource support desks recently, and Miami, amongst many schools in Ohio outsourced its service desk, and that would not have been nearly as successful or perhaps even possible without KCS, because we have a framework for providing people that don't sit in our building with the ability to answer questions. And without that framework, that would have been a very different picture.
Great. Yeah, I really like KCS in that it puts the information in the context and the perspective of the customer. So I think we talked a little bit about this. Chelsea may have addressed this one of the early questions, but to expand upon it, how do you recruit groups outside of customer support to participate and contribute knowledge?
Well, I guess since I did talk about it earlier, I should probably start on this one. So some of the initial groups that we brought in to contribute to the knowledge base did at least have access to our ITSM platform. So we're talking about other IT groups within the university, like our College of Business has their own IT department. Our law school has its own IT department. Our engineering and science schools have their own groups. So the first reach out was to other IT teams that just weren't part of the larger centralized organization. They were pretty excited and on board because it was directly integrated with the incident management that they were already doing. As we've gone on, we actually have brought in other groups that aren't technically like IT groups. So our Caleb Center for Teaching and Learning supports a platform called ePortfolio, and they don't depend on the OIT to support that software. They do it themselves, and they've got one part-time person in their office who's responsible for all contacts for it, and she had not been initially part of our ITSM framework because she wasn't part of the organization, but she actually reached out to us and said, I would love to contribute knowledge. And we were like, great, if you want to contribute knowledge, would you like to also receive incidents from us? Because we get contacted about ePortfolio all the time. So that was just a really great example of what you can do when your knowledge base starts to expand and starts to kind of gain that grassroots support, like we were talking about with the initial rollout. When that word of mouth starts getting to other people who are responsible for helping customers on campus, and they see the usefulness of your knowledge base and they come to you, that's a really great opportunity to engage them in the entire support framework as well. So the knowledge base is very often our gateway drug.
One thing I'd add, and just in terms of recruitment, is what we originally did is we had training from HDI on KCS specifically, and for the most part we had a lot of just customer support attending, but we also opened some of the seats as an invitation to a lot of our tier 2 groups and just other people within the organization, and so we've had people who went to that initial training, and it's been almost a year now or so, and they start hearing the rumblings about KCS and what we're doing and things like that. And since they have that context of going through the training, even if they didn't get certified or anything like that, they at least have a framework for it. And then I'm seeing a lot of people come up voluntarily and asking, hey, what can we do at KCS? Or just how can we, contribute to the knowledge base and things like that. So that might be a strategy that works for your organization if you have those seats available for training.
I think for us, we don't have any groups outside of IT, but we do have some second and third level engineering group type people participating. And really it's the answering the what's in it for me question for them. And Chelsea touched on what I think is the biggest one. If you don't participate in KCS, you're going to continue to receive a bunch of escalations from the service desk. And if you'd rather spend your time not doing engineering or writing code or rolling out network changes and would rather be answering customer support questions, feel free. Otherwise, participate in KCS, pass those answers back to the service desk, and they can answer them for you. And that message seems to resonate.
Yep, shipped and left. Sounds great. So our final question here, I've got a lot of questions in the queue, so this is awesome. Keep them coming in the chat window. I'll make sure that I monitor them and make them available at the end here. So what challenges have you experienced so far in your implementation?
So I'm going to cheat first and just give you a nice challenge that's come up and why it actually makes it fun for me. But the first challenge is just finding how KCS can fit within different groups or organizations in your IT environment. So just taking the core concepts of KCS and molding it into how it can work in different groups workflow is really the fun part for me. And now actual challenges, it's usually going to be, for us at least, sometimes it's culture related. And so like, for example, us publishing externally to a self-help knowledge base, the culture here is a little more apprehensive in doing that. And so that's something we've had to work through. We've had to not align ourselves completely with the KCS methodology to get part of that to work, just to accommodate some of the culture. One thing for the last thing for a challenge is just providing tangible reasons why people should participate in KCS. We've already gone over how do you recruit other groups and what do we do for internal folks, but sometimes you'll get people who just they need to see the actual results of how you're improving to get on board. So that's probably one of the other main challenges for us.
To piggyback on that idea of cultural challenges, we have a really big push towards accessibility, web accessibility, and our long KCS pre-KCS knowledge publishing process included steps to make sure that articles were accessible. But of course, one of the goals of KCS is to get that knowledge in the hands of the customers as fast as possible. And so that makes it everyone's job to make accessible knowledge articles. And so we've had to make some significant design changes to the structure of our articles. For instance, removing all screenshots and pictures, removing tables, that kind of thing. So it's simple text. And that has had some good side benefit as well, is that it's a lot easier to go back and update plain text instead of having to take new screenshots or update images or other things in our former multimedia knowledge articles. So that may seem like a step backwards in some ways, but we accepted that we were headed in that direction and made the best of it, and I think actually makes us more gives us more agility as a result. So that hasn't been too bad. And the other thing, like I mentioned before, was that lack of coaching. I think that was our biggest challenge so far that we've had in our implementation. And that problem even continues because we might have more and more people in KCS and they're enthusiastic about it, but they just don't have the time to dedicate to being a coach and being on, we call it the KCS Council, that determines which articles get published out and that kind of stuff. So we have more coaches or we have fewer coaches, like the ratio to the participants, and that continues to be a challenge for us.
Hey, Robert, this is a follow-up question on the answer you gave about culture. From Frank, is asking, can you talk more about what things you did to change for the KCS framework to align with the culture? So what adaptations did you make?
Yeah, I think I understand. So one of the big ones, like I said, the major culture shift or the major cultural challenge was publishing externally. So what we had to do is, as far as the KCS competencies goes, most people are capped off at being just contributors and not publishers. So giving access to individual agents to publish externally wasn't really in the cards for us at first. So that's something we had to change. And instead of having individual people who are just doing KCS on a day-to-day basis publishing, we have to have someone like a knowledge manager who actually reviews the activity of the knowledge in the knowledge base, like how many views and attaches to incidents are happening, to gauge what should be sent to the public. And so that's kind of been, instead of it happening organically on a transactional basis, like most of KCS is supposed to happen, we have to have this separate process to do the publishing.
We do a slightly different version of what Robert just described. We have that KCS council made up of our KCS coaches, and anytime a knowledge article has been cited by 3 or more incidents or tickets, it pops up into a queue, and then the KCS council, a member of it, grabs that knowledge article out and does those accessibility checks, make sure it's not a duplicate, make sure that the language is how we want it to be public facing, and then they publish it. So that's done pretty quickly still, even though it's not the normal participants who are doing that publishing.
Our system is actually like almost identical to Jeff's. We've got it so that once an article has been attached to 3 separate incidents, it then is moved into a queue where I and other knowledge admins can review and kind of make it ready for prime time.
So Jeff, I think Andrew's question is asking you about if you've received pushback from people who are using a lot of graphics or images or screenshots in documentation of KCS articles.
No, but part of the reason why is we were sued by the Department of Justice for accessibility, and so there's just no way to make those, and the part of the language of that is equal access, and it's really not possible to make a non-sighted person have equal access to an image like they can to text. And so that has been heard so loudly and clearly at Miami that helped that culture shift, and it really isn't a problem anymore.
Anybody else on the panel have any additional thoughts about challenges you've experienced in the implementation so far?
One of the challenges that we've been recently running into is that some of our higher level support teams really don't like it when you tell them that they can't edit their own public facing documentation directly. You hear things like, we're big boys and girls, we should be trusted with this. If you're very strict about KCS principles, everyone, no matter their level of expertise before going into the knowledge base, needs to prove their trustworthiness before they can edit public facing documentation. At Notre Dame, we're kind of reevaluating that and looking at options to open up articles to the author no matter what knowledge base they're currently located in. So if they're in that kind of KCS draft state where they're accessible to staff but not to customers, everyone has edit rights to them, but once it moves to that public facing knowledge base, we've kind of locked it down to a select number of people, and we're kind of looking at opening up a few loopholes that way, at both to kind of manage the politics of the situation, but also because subject matter experts really should have access to their own content. And even if they haven't been working in this knowledge base, they've been writing documentation for a very long time, and they'll get the gist of it as they go along.
Any final thoughts before we move into our question and answer round? Sorry, kind of sprung that question up on you. It wasn't in our rehearsal, but any thought you want to leave somebody with?
I mean, this has been such a transformative process. We've done lots of implementation of incident management and problem management and all those things. And those are always an incremental step forward and an incremental step in our maturity. But KCS really represented a large jump in that. And that hasn't been a short-term effect. We've been doing this for a year and a half now or so, and people are just as enthusiastic. We have people publishing the number of articles that are published to our external knowledge base. People mention that number in our Slack chat. at least every day, because people are just proud of it and excited of it. And it has really been transformative, more so than the introduction of a lot of those other processes to our organization. So we're quite pleased. You know, if we're frustrated about anything, it's the fact that we didn't do this 10 years ago.
One final thing I'd like to add is just, if you can, on the ground floor, is get a champion on your side who can really have some sort of weight in swaying some people around your organization. Just having that person who's always going to be casting KCS in a bright, shiny light, it just helps tremendously when talking to other people and trying to collaborate. So having that champion is something I would start to look for right at the beginning.
I would also add that even though there are a lot of technical challenges with implementing KCS, it is ultimately a culture change. And that is a very collaborative effort. Getting emotional buy-in from the teams that you're working with is really integral to keeping the knowledge base running. And to keep people from treating it like a project. A lot of people tend to treat knowledge as, oh, I'm gonna do my knowledge base, I'm gonna make it, and then it's done. Instead of treating it as an ever-evolving thing that requires constant minor maintenance. And getting that direct feedback from other teams as they use your content is a really valuable experience for any contributor, and is a really integral part of making KCS work in your organization.
Well, I have to give a personal plug for Robert, because here at USC, not only do we have that momentum going, but I think it's really cool to sustain it. We have a reward and recognition program where he gives these cool trophies to people that are the highest contributors and other criteria. So I think that's a great way to keep it going. Did you want to say anything real quick about that?
I was just going to say, if anybody wants to steal it, we call it the Solve Loop Champion of the Month. So if you want to steal that, you can.
All right, so we've got our questions. Just a reminder to our attendees, go ahead and just keep adding the questions. I'll start with the first one here. It's from Shannon from the University of Denver. She's asking about best practices for keeping information current or retiring articles, so the whole managing of the life cycle of the KCS articles.
Mm. And that's like that's one of the major points of KCS. So when you're citing knowledge articles internal to the organization, so somebody, you know, let's say the scenario is that somebody calls in and says, how do I get started using Windows? And the answer is you click on the start button in the bottom left-hand corner, and a Microsoft patch comes out overnight that puts the start button in the upper right-hand corner. So now somebody calls in and says, how do I do this? And you read the answer. The person at the support desk answers the call, reads the answer from the knowledge article that says, click the start button in the bottom left corner. Well, there is no start button. So, then you Google and you figure it out. Oh, this recent Microsoft patch moved it to the upper right. So the article gets edited and now it's in the upper right. Or maybe a new version of Windows comes out and it deprecates the start button entirely. It just isn't a thing. So that knowledge case will stop being the solution for things, and it will not be cited anymore. So you don't have to worry about its accuracy. People won't be looking for it. And on some sort of loop, it depends on the frequency of your organization, maybe 6 months or so. Every knowledge article goes to a subject matter expert and says, is this still relevant? Is this still accurate? And we have these neat, clean little single small articles that solve a particular issue. They're not the old giant articles that had a bunch of, like a mini FAQ hodgepodge of things. So they're really quite quick to pull up and say, yep, still relevant, still accurate, and then renew that 6 month, hit the snooze alarm for 6 months basically. So by those two mechanisms, the one where they're being constantly used, and then the other where we have this review process and they get reapproved, it keeps good knowledge in our public knowledge base. And if the article goes well past its 6 month review cycle, maybe a month or so, and there's some nasty grams and things involved, then it will just get unpublished and pulled down. And those, and it falls back in that loop of people at the service desk then have to answer that question. And so there reading the solution to people and validating it that way, so that maintains good quality knowledge.
Yeah, we have a pretty similar scenario here at USC. We do have it's set at an interval of 6 months, but we use it more for duplicate checks. And so we're not really reviewing too much for quality, because we are hoping that just the transactional nature of people using the knowledge will improve that. I mean, we have flagging and people directly editing articles that way. But mostly we use that interval of an article expiring in 6 months just to do just really light duplication checks.
Also, for things published to the world, there's a button at the bottom of the knowledge case that says, was this helpful? And if they say no, and even if they don't put in a reason why, I mean, reasons are nice and helpful, but even if somebody hits no, that puts it into a queue for us to look at and try and understand why. So sometimes it's because they picked the wrong article for their situation, but at other times it's because the solution no longer applies, and so we check and fix those, especially if we see a lot of no votes on a particular knowledge case.
Ryan from Central Michigan is asking how you deal with KCS when using cloud technologies like Office 365, Dropbox, Google, whatever, when it's always changing.
I've found that KCS is actually really valuable when working with cloud-based technologies. We're a Google Suite campus, so our email, a lot of our shared documentation, or shared docs in general, and calendaring, and all that fun stuff goes all through the Google Apps for Education. With KCS, our help desk actually has the power to update content as it becomes obsolete while people are asking for it. And so this actually goes back to the review question that we actually just had before this, where reuse is review. So as your support staff are using content, they are also reviewing it for accuracy. And there are enough people within our help desk that have edit rights on the public-facing documentation that they can update that content in real time, and they don't necessarily have to send it back to a subject matter expert every single time. That makes our documentation way more dynamic than it used to be when it was just very long FAQs posted on a website that like 3 people had edit rights to.
Okay. Frank has a 2-part question here. So who did you have in your KCS design workshop? Did you use consultants, do the training, or run the design workshop? And can you talk about training for your staff going from like KCS 1 to a 3 or coach, and just talk a little bit about your training involved with that?
Well, I can start at least with the training portion. What we do if somebody's being promoted through the competencies, it's usually a pretty light training. It's usually only about 15 to 20 minutes or so. And it's usually a coach sitting down with that person, going over their new abilities and the like, and then just setting them loose from there. And then when the coaches meet up with them for their regular intervals, they talk about how they're doing with this new power, if they have the ability to fix articles, whereas suppose they could only flag before. We talk about if there are any technical issues that you're encountering, any workflow issues you're encountering. So it's usually just a really quick light training up front, and then a lot of follow-up in the coaching sessions.
I think Robert's answer is excellent for that half of the question, so I'll answer the other half. The design of the process, we actually, so KCS is very different than the rest of the things that you might encounter like in an ITIL or something, where it's just a very loose framework and it is really open to interpretation for your specific environment. There may well be things like, we've had to make some modifications due to accessibility and what gets published out to the big community, but really it's something that can be taken off the shelf and applied very precisely and very directly. It's a lot more prescriptive than a lot of the frameworks that you might run into. And so our design process was much lighter than we might otherwise, because it's basically like, how do we use this tool to accomplish these things from this very prescriptive off-the-shelf framework? And that was a lot easier than, like rolling out change management was, for instance. And we had the fortune of some folks using our same tool set trailblazing for us, and we had heard some conference presentations about how they use the fields and their lessons learned from that. And so kind of getting in a little bit later in the game was to our advantage, because we got very, very quickly going with it and have had to make very few in-stream changes.
So for us, and I guess this is where my perspective is a little bit different because I come from a smaller organization. The OIT is less than 250 people. So we have a very small team compared to some larger state schools. I, as the knowledge management associate, was sent out for KCS certification through HDI. And then I provided training to just about everybody else. And for pretty much the first year to 2 years, I've been pretty much the sole coach for the entire org. But as KCS is rolling out to more and more teams, I'm starting to have to delegate some of that coaching responsibility to what we call our KCS heroes, who are people that have kind of proven their mettle with contributing to the knowledge base, and so we're asking them to take on more of a leadership role as well. On top of that, as far as design, we had a very small design team. It was me, the manager of the help desk, and two of our ITSM platform sysadmins working together to develop a plan to essentially make the knowledge base that was built into our platform to perform according to KCS standards.
So this next question from Earl at the UC Davis is very similar. He's asking about a process design question. So for large organizations that have a lot of departments using their own knowledge base, talk to us about best practices for publishing articles. Does one group manage it, or does each group able to manage their own articles? And so how do you maintain a consistent look and feel for these articles?
I have my recommendation would be not to attempt to use existing, and this is a good point that we haven't discussed previously. There's one or more knowledge bases probably exist in your organization, and I would not try to pull those articles into the KCS fold. I would start afresh with KCS generating new content. And so in the intermediary period, I would have your associates in your service desk searching the existing knowledge in those legacy knowledge bases. And as they see content used, putting it in the client context and moving it into your KCS enabled knowledge base. And then once you have one KCS enabled knowledge base that is being managed through the framework, then it would be, in our case, the KCS Council that would be deciding what gets published to the live knowledge base. And if we had a group like HR or something involved there, I imagine they would have their own distinct KCS Council, and HR-related cases wouldn't be approved by the IT KCS Council. It would be the one or more people in HR that would actually be doing that publishing.
And
Go ahead. Sorry, Chelsea. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing, because this is, even though we're a smaller organization, we have run into this. If you've got IT teams that are insisting that they need their own knowledge base, try to encourage them in any way possible to stay within the fold of a centrally managed one. If that means giving someone within their team a little bit more power to control public content, that's fine. In my opinion, it's better to have all of the knowledge accessible to all of your IT staff, no matter what group they're in, than to have teams squirreling away content in kind of their own back corners of separate knowledge bases. That's kind of where our organization ran into trouble before, is that we had kind of lack of access to documentation that was managed by other groups, and so information was getting lost a lot of the time. So try and keep as many people within the fold as possible.
Yeah, having a siloed knowledge is not good. I completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, we have way more questions than time, but our panelists have been kind enough to provide their contact information if you want to follow up with them. Appreciate everyone attending. I appreciate the panelists for giving their time to us. This has been a great presentation. I just want to let you know that this is being recorded, and we will have a recording available to you on the ITSM wiki site within 5 business days. If you have an idea for a webinar or would like to present, I'm always looking for fresh ideas. Please feel free to reach out to me via the listserv email. And again, I just want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Robert, Chelsea, Jeffrey, for giving your time. If you want to see where the past recordings are, they're always posted and available on the ITSM wiki site. Thank you for your attendance, and have a nice day.
I'd like to thank Mitch for doing all the legwork to make this possible and bring it all together. Thanks for your scheduling and coordination and script making and everything else. We really appreciate it, Mitch.
It's so much fun. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.